I should say that the complete title is Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza on Praxis and the difference between speculative and practical sciences. So, in what follows, I will focus primarily on Disputation 11 of his Universa Filosofia de Substancia Corporea Animata. And, well, I have two main goals. The first is to clarify the distinction between practical and speculative sciences, focusing on the roles of the subject, the end, and the object of a science, the role they play in their differences. And then I would focus on praxis, but I will, at this time, I will keep myself to the difference between the speculative and practical habit. Disputation 11 is relatively brief, with only 38 paragraphs, divided in 5 sections, and it deals with one difference between speculative and practical sciences, whether practical sciences deal with free acts, with the definition of a practical act, with the question whether an act can be simultaneously practical and speculative, and with the peculiar causality of practical acts. The 5 sections can be seen as a series of questions guided by Hurtado de Mendoza's shrewd analysis. Aquinas is the main authority that we critically examined, though Hurtado de Mendoza here is careful to distinguish Aquinas from his disciples. And the doctrine of these passages, of course, has ramifications both in the realms of anthropological and practical philosophy, as well as in discussions on scientific methodology. The first question may be formulated like this: is the distinction between the resolutive and compositive methods a sufficient way of distinguishing practical and speculative sciences? I will first look at Hurtado de Mendoza's formulation of this question within the context of his writings, then turn to Aquinas, and then again to Hurtado's answer. Let me first give two quick examples. At the beginning of the 1600s, there are 2 texts, and we can find some. I'm sorry, is this? Yes. Verticism. Sorry. Thanks. Yes, hopefully. At the beginning of the 1600s, we can find some common descriptions distinguishing practical and speculative sciences. We turn, for example, to Juan Sánchez Cedeño's Cuestiones ad Universam Aristotelis Logica. In his Proemium, he collects 3 differences between the practical and speculative sciences. First, the practical habit has for its end the opus, while the speculative habit has the contemplation of the truth. Second, the practical habit proceeds in a compositive mode. That is to say, it teaches how a form may be introduced in matter, or how an operation may be realized, as is clear in moral virtues and in mechanical arts, while the speculative habit proceeds in a resolutive mode, resolving conclusions onto their principles. It teaches how we may acquire a certain cognition of this truth, for example, that a man can laugh, and from this resolution it moves towards the first principles that show this, namely, teaching that a man can laugh because he is admirativus, and admirativus because he is rational. Lastly, the third difference is that the practical habit deals with things modo operabili, while the speculative habit similarly deals with things that may be operabilis and yet does not deal with them in modo operabili, but rather in a resolutive mode, deducing its passions from its principles. Likewise, it is intrinsic to the object of the practical habit to be operable through the principles of art, and this is constitutive to it insofar as the object of art is the practical habit. Of course, having the opus as its end, being compositive in that it teaches how to place a form in matter, and dealing with its object, modo operabile, are all related. A similar exposition, perhaps more detailed, we may find in Antonio Rubio's commentary in Universam Aristotelis Dialectica. He applies this criteria to the science of logic and formulates an interesting duality. In question 5 of the Proemium, he claims on one hand that the practical science is that which is not only the re operabili or dirigibili, but also proceeds modo operabili and operating towards an end, or ordained to the direction of operations. Logic meets these 3 conditions, and therefore it is a practical science. Now, on the other hand, speculative science is one that deals with re speculabili and proceeds in a resolutive mode. and is ordained towards the nature of its end, which is speculative. But this is also logic, which is therefore speculative. Rubio goes on to explain, logic is practical because it operates or directs the operations of the intellect in a compositive way by means of ordaining these operations towards the construction of a syllogism or some other instrument. And yet it is speculative because its object has passions that can be demonstrated in the logic that is taught, logica docens. And we can proceed with these demonstrations towards first principles in a resolutive mode, which ordains us to speculative nature of its object. It would seem we can make our way through this apparent duality by just applying the first difference that Sanchez and I have pointed out, namely, as logic can be approached according to both the resolutive and compositive method, the difference between its speculative or practical consideration pertains only to the difference in the end each consideration has. Now, let us look a little more closely to the purpose of these different methods. Rubio employs them to deal with the relations between the components of a science. In general, the resolutive relation, analytic, we may say, represents the consists of in the vein of the material cause, and the compositive relation, that we may call synthetic, constitutive, constructive, represents being for. Theoretical sciences employ the resolutive method because they intend to arrive to first principles. The resolutive method allows precisely for a hierarchical ascent as it makes the underlying principles explicit. For example, the principles of physical sciences can be analyzed until we arrive at the general principles of philosophy of nature, then to the general principles of ontology, and so on. In terms of their systematic order, we could say that the de anima presupposes the generazione e corruzione, which in turn leads to the physics, etc. Since the resolutive mode allows for the analysis proper of theoretical sciences, we may associate it not only with the speculative scientific mode, but also with the aspect of a science as directed towards learning, scientia docens. As the compositive mode looks onto the construction of a particular object as the end of a process involving a specific purpose, we may associate it with the practical side of science, science as utens. Rubio will ultimately see logic as both science and art, and even goes as far as identifying the docens scientia aspect of logic on one hand and its utens ars dimension on the other, while acknowledging that Vasquez and Suarez have also employed this presentation and yet insisting that he was the first that came up with it. But Rubio has a final word in all this entanglement because in the end he claims that logic is practical from within, regardless of its actual use. And in the same fashion, he criticizes a common position that held that sciences are only practical when used practically. So, after looking at these two texts, I think it's understandable that Hurtado de Mendoza begins distinction 11 with a first section that asks about the duality between the resolutive and compositive modes, which, as we have seen, have become common enough to serve as a quick marker to distinguish sciences. Hurtado de Mendoza holds that Thomists differentiate practical and speculative sciences according to the way they proceed in reaching their conclusions. One, practical sciences are compositive and speculative or resolutive. This seems, as we have seen, intuitive enough. The method of speculative sciences is one that resolves conclusions in principles, and speculation aims to know the causes and principles of things, while practical sciences aim to compose, to make way for something new. Well, ultimately, the main basis for the speculative-practical distinction is Aristotle. Hurtado de Mendoza is actually looking towards Thomas Aquinas, who deals with this issue in Summa Theologiae Prima Pars Quaestio 14, which deals with God's science. For our current purpose, however, we can briefly make use of further passages of Aquinas. The first point to be made is that for St. Thomas, speculative and practical reason are not different faculties, for id quod accidentaliter seavit ad objecti rationem, quam respicuit aliquo potentia, non diversificat potentia. When reason directs itself towards the pure knowledge of an object, it is speculative. When its end is the goal of an action, moral or artistic, it is practical. It should be noted then that the difference between practical and speculative knowledge is not attached, according to Thomas, to the object. For the object of intellection, being ordained to action or not is, in this sense, an accidental feature, and thus the speculative intellect is the one that what it apprehends does not ordain towards an opus, but only towards the consideration of truth, while the practical intellect, whatever it apprehends, it directs towards an opus. And this is why the philosopher said in the Anima 3 that the speculative differs from the practical in its end. The end or goal is for Aquinas the defining feature that distinguishes the practical and speculative act of the intellect. And this is why the practical intellect can be called a rule for action. There is another significant passage in Aquinas in which he clearly explains the end as the decisive factor, namely the Veritate 14, question 4. And I quote, "For the practical understanding is the same as the operative understanding. Hence, only extension to a work makes an understanding practical. Reference to desire, however, either antecedent to consequent, does not withdraw the understanding from the category of speculative understanding. For unless one were attracted to speculating about the truth, there would never be any pleasure in the act of speculative understanding. And this is contrary to the philosopher, who says that the purest pleasure is in the act of speculative understanding. Nor does every reference to a work make the understanding practical, because simple speculation can be for someone the remote occasion for doing something. Thus, a philosopher contemplates the immortality of the soul, and from this, as from a remote cause, he takes occasion to do something. But to be practical, the understanding must be the proximate rule of action, as that by which one studies the thing to be done, the methods of operation, and the causes of the work. It is evident, however, that the object of faith is not a truth which can be produced, but the uncreated truth which can be an object only of speculative understanding." Aquinas is dealing here with faith, more specifically with the locus of faith as virtue. Some, he says, believe faith resides not in the will, for it implies a cognitive aspect, but rather in the intellect, and more specifically in the practical intellect. This leads into his treatment of the practical intellect. For many of these authors, he claimed do not understand what it is. So he points out these three clarifications. First of all, the practical intellect is the same as the speculative. The only difference is the relation to an opus. Second, passions or affections do not render the act practical or speculative. And third, while it is the relation to an opus what makes the intellect practical, this cannot be said in an unrestricted sense. It is only the relation to an opus as proxima regula operis, for it is through the practical intellect that we consider what is operable and its causes. Let us note here that the difference between compositio and resolutio are not mentioned at all. And by beginning with this difference, Hurtado de Mendoza, I think, is critically aiming past accidental distinctions. It is only because the practical act of the intellect looks towards action that it deals with a causal application that can make way for its goal. In this sense, it leads to a compositive consideration, moving from simplicity to complexity. It aims to apply forms, objectives, principles, intentions to matter in a complex causal world rich with circumstances. This would also connect the practical knowledge's direction towards what is singular, in contrast with the universal focus of speculative knowledge as per the Nicomachean ethics. In contrast with Rubio, therefore, we now seem to have the end, the extension towards a work, as the defining feature of practical science. What does Aquinas make then of the difference between the resolutive and compositive methods? He deals with this precisely in his commentary on the Nicomachean ethics, as he deals with the variability of moral considerations regarding external goods. And I quote Aquinas again: "Since in the art of demonstrative science principles must conform to conclusions, it is desirable and preferable when treating subjects so variable, and when proceeding from premises likewise variable, to bring out the truth first in a rough outline by applying universal principles to singulars, and by proceeding from the simple, universal, to the complex, particular, where acts are concerned. For it is necessary in every practical science to proceed in a composite, i.e. deductive, manner. On the contrary, in speculative science, it is necessary to proceed in an analytical manner by breaking down the complex into elementary principles." End quote. St. Thomas, however, does not absolutely tie the resolutive mode to speculative reasoning and the compositive mode to practical reasoning. Two brief examples. In his commentary on the Anima 3, he recognizes the practical intellect proceeds a posterius ad prius, that is, in a resolutive mode, when we deliberate the agendis, insofar as we first presuppose the end and then proceed orderly to inquire about those things which are for the sake of the end. This is the case because the end is prior only in knowledge, not in reality. An analogous case may be found in theoretical arguments that proceed by propter quid arguments, from which, in which we move towards a conclusion per discursum a causis ineffectis. That is, from what is more simple to what is more complex. For these clarifications, I think we can now go back to Hurtado de Mendoza's text and appreciate his point more fully. According to Hurtado de Mendoza, Thomists commonly hold that a practical science is one that proceeds in a compositive mode, while a speculative science is one that proceeds in a resolutive mode. I.e., practical science conjoins form with matter, while speculative science returns to its rationes. It resolves its conclusions in principles. If we followed Aquinas, says Hurtado de Mendoza, we'd realize the proper feature of what we call the practical intellect and its practical act is that supra speculativum adere voluntatem exequendi objectum utrius queratus. This would entail that God acts speculatively when referring to possible creatures, quas non vult creare, and practically when referring to is quas creat. Likewise, an architect would act speculatively when considering his art as a whole, and practically when applying his will to a specific work. But to employ the compositive mode as the mark of practical sciences is inconclusive. Actually, Hurtado de Mendoza holds that God has a particular science of angels, even if he does not induce a form in matter, and it is not by the composition form matter that angels understand how to apply their will to an action. The resolutive compositive distinction is therefore quite accidental, valde accidentario. Indeed, Hurtado de Mendoza will claim below, practical sciences also employ resolutive approaches through which they redunt causas eorum quae faciunt. This is because arguing about something by its causes, that is, employing the resolutive method, is a feature proper to science itself, just as the distinction between practical and speculative is something proper of science itself. Properly, a practical science should be defined as that which directs the faculty towards the objectum efficiendum. On the other hand, the theoretical science is the one that consists in the sole contemplation of the object. That is to say, the science that is carried out only for knowledge itself. But is it possible, and how may we account for the fact that even practical issues can be studied in a purely theoretical fashion? An architect, for example, may study the science of materials just from the viewpoint of speculative knowledge, with no immediate practical purpose in mind. Aquinas had made way precisely for such a possibility with a triple distinction in Summa Theologiae, the one Hurtado de Mendoza is considering here. Again, I'm quoting Aquinas. Some science may be only speculative, only practical, or it may be, in a sense, speculative and in a certain sense practical. Science can be said to be speculative in three ways. First, according to the thing that is known, which are not operable to the subject that knows, and such is the human science of natural or divine things. Secondly, according to the way of knowledge, think of a builder that considers a house by defining and dividing and considering its universal predicates. These, while operabilia, are considered in a speculative fashion, and not according to their being operabilia. For operabile is something by application of form to matter, not by the resolution of the composite in formal universal principles. And third, with regards to the end. For the practical intellect differs from the speculative with regards to its end. The practical intellect is ordained towards the goal of the operation, while the end of the speculative intellect is the consideration of truth. Therefore, as an architect considers how a certain building may be construed, he is not ordained towards the end of the operation, but only towards cognition. In this case, with regards to the end, the consideration will be speculative, even while dealing with something operable. The science that is speculative in the second way, or according to the end, is speculative in one respect and practical in another. And the science that is ordained towards the goal of the operation is simpliciter practico. And so we find again the distinction mentioned at the beginning of this paper. A science can be theoretical practical according to its end, to its object, or to the way it is known. The usefulness of such a model seems clear, for I can immerse myself in the knowledge of operabilia for purely speculative reasons, without intending to immediately engage in a practical action. We have seen Albert the Great use this to deal with ethics, as do other authorities like Scotus and Aquinas, distinguishing ethica utens, ethica docens. Occam will also make use of the distinction, claiming that semper fines vel finis es causa distinctionis scientiarum. However, Occam also mentions two things. First, that finis should be taken here non proprie sed proilo quod secundum rectam rationem deberet esse finis. And second, that scientia in neutro modo distinguntur per subjecta sed secundo modo distinguntur per objecta. Hurtado de Mendoza will focus on a point that touches on these. What makes it so that the subject of practical knowledge can have a goal for reoperabilia, distinct from the pure consideration of the object? This not being the case for things that can only be speculated upon. Does it not make sense to think that the object determines what can have a goal outside mere contemplation, and not only the subject of the act of reason? Moreover, is it not the subject of the act of reason the one that determines what kind of object it can think of, thus determining what can be for him operabilia or not? In Rodrigo Arriaga's cursus, we find a similar line of thinking. The knowledge of the Archangel Michael is available to God's intellect, says Arriaga, in quite a different way from the one the human mind may have of the Archangel Michael. According to Hurtado de Mendoza, the largest demarcation that we may sketch between speculative and practical sciences actually has to do with the division between the increated and created beings. God's science has no goal outside of himself, since God is outside all causes. The object of practical sciences, then, would seemingly have to be restrained to created things. For Hurtado de Mendoza, the object is not only seen as an end, but as an extrinsecum terminum, and practical sciences become in a way quasi principium objecti. So, would it not be possible to conjoin senses 2, the way of knowing, and 3, the end of the act of reason mentioned by Aquinas? According to Aquinas, a science is practical if the intellect's act is regarded as a proximate cause of action. But we could try to make a reduction. If the end of the practical action is to engage with an operabile qua operabile, the end of such an action would seem to entail a practical approach. This is, I think, what Hurtado de Mendoza has in mind when he claims if a science teaches how to operate, it teaches in an operable way. For he who knows about an operable object also becomes aware of how to act according to this knowledge. Even if a particular act of knowledge is not carried out with a particular desire to act, it still looks upon the object as susceptible of being acted upon, or to serve as the end of an action. And therefore, Hurtado de Mendoza concludes, si docet operari, non sistit in contemplatione objecti. Aquinas and others had overridden this reduction by deeming practical only the act that constitutes the proximate rule of action. Thus, the end and not the object of a science seem to be the definitive criterion. And this is why Hurtado also claims that logic is a practical science. For one thing, it proceeds in a compositive way, inducendo formam syllogistica in intellectu. For another, its actions are not for their own sake, but for the sake of something else, to learn to reason. And in the end, when one contemplates an object and contemplation leads to its being effectable, this cognition regards the object in an operable way. Seems to be that it would be perhaps insufficient to claim that a speculative science may teach about operations, but still remain speculative so long as it does not teach in modo operabile, while practical sciences teach in this mode. Perhaps the real distinction between these sciences, as per Hurtado de Mendoza, revising this. Scientia practica es quae non apertitur gratia sui, sed operis gratia. It follows from this that logic is not a speculative science, but a practical science, so far as the acts of logic are dirigentes intellectum in constructione modiscium, even if they proceed in a compositive way. In Disputationes Metaphysicae 44, Suarez recovers his position, namely the one that distinguishes the speculative and practical habit ex objecto materiali, which he attributes to Algacer, and claims cannot be a sufficient difference, for there can be a purely speculative consideration of objects de re operability. He then acknowledges that others employ a more formal version of the object, which considers it modo docens or modo utens, and says this ultimately coincides with Aristotle's distinction about the end or goal of science. Suarez thus orders the three differences that follows from the beginning. But for his own part, Suarez claims that the division of these habits is not dependent on the will, but rather is prior to the will, and thus is convenient to the intellect itself. So the speculative habit will allow the speculative intellect to become more perfect, and likewise for the practical intellect. He concludes then that habitus ergo intellectualis optime dividetur in practicum et speculativum ex subjectum. And thus in the end, Suarez seems to acknowledge too that this is not possible at all if we don't consider the matter at hand. For how can a habit improve its subject if it has no appropriate object to act upon? So the difference in Suarez, in the end, is in the object, being re operabilia or not. I will conclude now with two theses that perhaps can be extracted from Hurtado de Mendoza's Disputatio. Thesis 1, the end of knowledge should be integrated in the objective difference of sciences. The difference between an object as operabilis and thus operabilis modo non operabile should just mean the difference between approximate and the remote rule for action. It is the object itself which allows for a goal as a terminum extrinsicum insofar as it becomes the object of a practical habitual consideration. The goals of the agent can only make way for themselves if the object can be attained from a practical viewpoint, which connects to the second and last thesis. This is too, the difference between practical and speculative sciences introduces freedom into this consideration. How can freedom enter philosophical thought? Sorry. By realizing that freedom is implied in the consideration of an object as operable. By claiming practical sciences as becoming quasi-principii objecti, I think, Hurtado de Mendoza moves in this direction. Practical sciences, in their most immediate sense to us, have to do with our being principles of things. The real distinction between practical and speculative sciences does not have to do primarily with their method, but with the possibility of taking the consideration of an object as a principle of the realization of such an object. And that's why they are said to be gratia objecta, objecti. In other words, practical sciences have to do with human freedom and the ability of our intellect to bring about the principles necessary for an action. On the plane of practical reason, we may find a pale analogy between human action and divine creation. Speculative sciences, on the other hand, cannot be but for the sake of their object, because their object cannot come to be through their cognizing subject. I think these two theses recover the idea that a practical habit is not a mechanical technique by which we manage information about the world, but rather a way of looking into the world itself, different from the speculative habit. In my opinion, perhaps Arriaga and Hurtado de Mendoza note this in their own way. The way an object differs according to the subject's intellect can perhaps be reconciled with the way an object is presented of itself as speculative or practical to me. Thanks.